This week on the agenda, was Boris bad for business? We'll be finding out if Britain's current political turmoil has discredited the UK on the international stage. Out with the old and in with the new. We now know that Britain will have a new Prime Minister by September the 6th. But whoever takes over following the resignation of Boris Johnson, what's going to be on their to-do list? The economy has to be top. This year, inflation has already hit a 40-year high, and the economy has been shrinking. The UK is widely tipped to experience a technical recession later this year. The Bank of England forecasts a huge downturn between October and December, with a contraction of almost 1%. That all affects the cost of living. The new PM will face the UK's largest drop in real income since the 1950s. Soaring food and energy prices are further deepening the crisis. Economists expect the next person in charge will need to do yet more to help households and save the struggling economy. And of course, there's also the continuing fallout over Brexit, and especially what's going to happen with regards to the Northern Ireland Protocol. Boris was apparently happy to break European law to get what he wanted. Will his successor feel the same? Remember, one of the pitches for Brexit was being able to trade freely with the rest of the world. But since Britain left the European Union, the number of UK-EU trading relationships has seen a steep decline due to regulatory red tape. The UK government's spending watchdog has said changes from Brexit may have been a factor in the UK lagging behind all other G7 economies in its post-pandemic recovery. One legacy the outgoing British Prime Minister will leave behind is leading Britain's response to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Britain's helping hand led to Ukrainians hailing Boris as a hero, even naming a street after him in a small town on the outskirts of Odessa. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky will be hoping this solidarity continues once the new leader steps in. Joining me now to consider Britain's future is Professor Amelia Hadfield, Dean International and Head of the Politics Department at the University of Surrey, and political economist and best-selling author Will Hutton. Thanks both of you for coming on the programme. Now, Amelia, if I can start with you first of all. The last few weeks in Westminster have been like a soap opera, a circus. Do you think this makes Britain look ridiculous in the eyes of the rest of the world?
I'd go for Wagnerian epic, actually, because it seems to have gone on so long and it's got so many sort of torrid elements. Yes and no. I mean, every nation state has its domestic upheavals. The way in which it has sort of unfolded probably has a higher degree of drama than possibly in some other countries. But if you look to Europe, you know, we've had a massive turnover in terms of types and shifts of government in Italy and France and Germany. So I think the sort of the churn itself isn't particularly remarkable. I think what's been remarkable is the enormous amount of press that it's had, the high drama associated with a very deeply personalized type of politics that we have here in the UK. And of course, going from knowing who the Prime Minister is to obviously a competition where, at least up until perhaps the last couple of days, it still feels really very wide open. And politics doesn't really deal well when there's nebulous elements. So the idea of not knowing at this point who the next leader is going to be, the sort of policy direction, the impact that's going to have in terms of strategy for Britain in the next 5 to 10 years, that to some degree feels a little bit like a fluctuation at this point. But absolutely, you know, thrilling, I think, for people watching it, and particularly political scientists.
So very much the politics of personality more than in politics of parties. Well, I wonder if that's something that you agree with. I mean, do you think that a change of leadership is going to be enough to get Britain back on track at home and abroad?
Well, I rather agree with Amelia in that the churn and political drama is certainly not unique to the UK. That said, I think that I think two things are kind of worth pointing out. One is that Prime Minister Boris Johnson was a big beast. And it's become evident, as you see the people vying to be his successor as prime minister, that the degree of charisma that Johnson had was exceptional. And I would say that without it, Britain would not have left the European Union. And now, and I regard the European Union, I regard that decision as a baleful one and a bad one, and very hard to make work successfully. And I think what people are going to be looking at internationally is that Britain's landed itself with this kind of decision to leave the European Union. Trying to make it work is going to be very difficult. And the amount of political talent at the Tory party's disposal to make it work is kind of not great. And once you get into a kind of world, and one of the reasons why Johnson lost the premiership was interesting, not so much over policy, but actually over his trustworthiness, and over people felt that he was a liar. And it's interesting that none of the leadership candidates would actually have him back in their cabinet because he is so toxic. And it was that toxicity that actually cost him his job. And that toxicity, of course, is cast over Brexit now. So I think what people will be wondering internationally is, as the Brits try to make this hapless decision work, and the architect of it is out of the frame, is it possible? And actually, what kind of missteps will take place before you get a government that actually tries to make Brexit work, not by de-aligning from the European Union, but actually trying to build bridges to it, but on the basis of being kind of independent state, but part of the kind of European family of states. And there's no, you can't deny geography. So yes, it was wonderful theatre. Yes, it's kind of preoccupying. Is it unusual in Europe? No. The outcome, though, is going to be very important for Britain's relationships with the rest of the world.
You talked a lot about Brexit there and the UK leaving the European Union. So, Amelia, let's stick with that for now, because one of the biggest things that's going to be in the new Prime Minister's inbox is going to be dealing with the continued fallout from Brexit, and particularly the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol. What do you expect to see happen there?
Well, I certainly agree that it is an opportunity to press the reset button, and I really very deeply hope that the sort of trends or path dependency, if you like, that have emerged in the past couple of years are not replicated. Despite what Johnson has said, Brexit simply isn't done. That's such a throwaway phrase. It's almost a fridge magnet. There are an enormous number of problems that still exist, and we can certainly talk about the way in which Britain wants to navigate itself on the high seas, if you like, from anything from climate change to trade. But certainly the most parlous of these issues is the UK's supposed new plan to re-engage with Northern Ireland, and as we all know, the UK wants to make and has already made a variety of changes under the Brexit deal. Certain goods, as you remember, have to be checked when they enter Northern Ireland from Great Britain. That's the current process. The goods are checked at various ports in Northern Ireland on arrival, and then they can be moved into the Republic of Ireland once checked. That has thrown up a whole series of problems, physical problems, material problems, logistical issues, and it has very sadly promoted a lot of division and divisiveness that have themselves pushed out more sectarian clashes, some violence, even as we saw last year. So the UK's suggestion is this is simply not good enough, and they need a new plan. I think my worry is that there has simply not been enough engagement with Brussels, because Brussels has come up with a number of very good suggestions, at least in my part. it's not necessarily watering down, but they're changes and amendments that make what is a very logistically tight, real bottleneck of an issue there, more doable, more workable. But the UK has, I think, been fairly deaf to some of these overtures at this point and have gone ahead with a sort of green light, red light, or green lane, red line approach in terms of splitting goods into two different lanes. So goods destined only for Northern Ireland itself go into what they call the green lane, and that's not supposed to be checked. But everything else, goods destined to go to Ireland and then back, well, within the European Union, possibly back to mainland Europe, that goes to the red line, and those checks are carried out. For the UK, that perspective seems to make the difference, but that misalignment or parallelism, if you like, has been rejected by Brussels. So even sort of logistical issues like that remain all to play for. Beyond that, you've got tax rules associated with this, and of course the very real issue that the protocol itself still stands hugely opposed by a whole range of unionist parties, arguing that it places an effective border across the Irish Sea. So whether it's the macro issue of the protocol or the sort of micro issue of how you deal with these lanes, the incoming British Prime Minister is going to have to take a good hard look, not just at what that problem is, but the sort of toxic divisiveness in terms of the negotiation attitude that preceded it, and really try to get over that and press that reset button and try much, much harder next time.
Will, now that even the opposition leader, Keir Starmer, has said that Brexit is irreversible, what could a future British Prime Minister do? What do you see the role of the UK becoming, and the relationship, how the relationship between the UK and Europe is going to develop?
Well, one thing, there's an iron rule in politics that whenever any politician of right or left in any state says something is irreversible or here for 1,000 years or whatever those grandiloquent claims, they're always disproved wrong. And I don't think for a minute that that's a position that will hold in Britain. And the big debate over the next kind of few years is actually to what extent does Britain allow its regulatory structures and its foreign defence policy to kind of diverge from its partners in Europe, or to what extent does it try to make common cause? And if it's defence and foreign policy, it's absolutely obvious that you have to make common cause given what's happening in the Ukraine. And actually, in a way, Johnson championing the Sweden and Finland joining NATO was quite an interesting kind of pro-European move by him. And Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary in Britain, who I expect will stay in post, and the next British government will actually carry on with that. And so you then have this economic question. And actually, I personally think that actually what has to happen, and it'll be building block by building block, whether it be rock and roll bands touring Europe, whether it be mutual recognition of professional qualifications, whether it be in highly complicated knowledge-based industries like aerospace or pharmaceuticals, where actually if British companies want to export into the European markets, they're going to have to comply with European regulations. There's going to be a succession of bespoke deals that will ultimately become the basis for some kind of association agreement with the European Union. And that may then become a platform for rejoining the single market and the customs union. But Keir Starmer does not want to open that one up before 2024, because if you talk to leading Labour politicians, what they will say is you couldn't make that commitment even to rejoin the single market and customs union without making an attendant promise to have a referendum on it. And actually, they don't want to go into the next election with the words referendum on Europe in their manifesto, even on just rejoining the single market and the customs union.
So it's interesting you're talking there about bespoke deals happening, but maybe a sliding scale in terms of the time frame. Amelia, let me bring you in on this, because trade deals are still very much up for grabs in the post-Brexit world. Some have been signed, or some, I suppose they're not actual trade deals, they're memorandums of agreement, maybe watered down. But, you know, where should the next Prime Minister be looking for the next deal?
Free trade agreements are sort of the gold standard to some extent in terms of how you do foreign policy abroad. Its counterpart, of course, is security and defense. But one of the interesting methods by which Britain has attempted to assert that it's making a success of Brexit in the first couple of years following Brexit, and now in the sort of more post-Brexit era definitively, is, of course, through FTAs. So every time a sort of free trade agreement is returned to the department, or just simply sort of returned to the UK as a whole, it's deemed to be a triumph. And I suppose to some extent, I want to be a little careful here, because it is really quality versus quantity. You can have an absolute proliferation of free trade agreements with countries with whom you have, sort of 0.01% in terms of GDP with trade. So they look good because you get a flag, but in trade terms, actually, materially, they don't do very much. The UK has signed a number of trade agreements, of course, since leaving the European Union. It's a bit of a sort of happy families, if you like. I think the ones that really made their mark is the agreement with Australia that was signed in December 2021. And then earlier this year, one with New Zealand. They're not yet enforced. They do take a long time. They take a long time to put together to begin with, and then even longer, I think, to finally ratify and put into force. And a more interesting one, I think, is a digital trade agreement with Singapore, signed in February of this year. That has entered into force. That was last month. So the UK has a sort of menu, if you like, of ones that have been achieved, and they have to. There's a bit of a lag time, I think, between signing one and seeing the impact it actually has in terms of trade and industry. And then, of course, the sort of forward-looking plan of who else do we want to engage with, who else do we want to sign with. So the UK government, of course, has started negotiations for various trade agreements with countries. I'm interested, I think, in the division between doing country-to-country ones, so bilateral ones, perhaps with Canada, for example, or India. Negotiations for India, for example, started earlier this year. And the type of trade, quite frankly, that we've come out of, and that's a regional trade agreement, something that is club-based, if you like. So having come out of the European Union, the UK obviously has to do either rollover agreements and try to sort of get them back in by the back door, or cultivate new bilats. But my sense is that sort of the way of the future for trade is, because it's so interlocking and it hinges on interdependencies and very critical supply chains, it makes a lot more sense to do these in a very comprehensive and regional way. So the one that I'm really looking out for is the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that's pretty enormous. It's a trade agreement between 11 countries across the Trans-Pacific area, but also involving folk like Canada, Chile, Japan, etc. The UK applied to join this in February 2021, and negotiations started last year. The government wants to try to conclude this by the end of the year. I think it's both a good thing and also kind of highly ironic that the UK decided, largely on the basis, I think, of trade as well as many other things, to come out of the European Union, only to look, really quite assiduously at being able to go back into a regional trade agreement with a whole host of areas and countries. And again, it might be very helpful, but the idea of trade is it has to land at home and it has to generate decent partners abroad. So this one, I think, has to tick enough boxes in terms of GDP to actually make a very real difference, and quite frankly, act as a catalyst to pull Britain out of what's clearly a sort of incoming recession, much of which is going to be driven by industrial output.
So much to talk about, but let's take a short break now. Stay with us, because still to come here on the agenda. Could a new Prime Minister mean a new approach to the conflict in Ukraine?
Roger, that's clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Welcome back to the agenda. Still with me are Professor Amelia Hadfield, Dean International and Head of the Politics Department at the University of Surrey, and political economist and best-selling author Will Hutton. We've talked about a couple of our words: referendum, recession, so let's stick with that one. Will, when it comes to the economy, it's certainly going to be top priority for the government. Cost of living is soaring, fuel prices are sky high, energy bills are going to go up, while wages are pretty much going nowhere. The UK needs cheaper homes, it needs lower commercial rents, tax reform. The economy is something the new Prime Minister is really going to have to prioritise, but is it a poisoned chalice?
A poisoned chalice. I mean, I wouldn't describe it quite like that. I mean, I think Britain's economic difficulties are deep-seated, and they've been around for, let's say, the last 50 years, if not longer. And so, whatever administration or whatever political hue has to deal with them. I mean, the ongoing poor investment levels, the poor productivity levels, et cetera, and also the migration from a world of tangible investment to intangible investment. This is a world in which kind of knowledge, intellectual capital, and patents, copyrights is much more important than actually kind of producing things in factories. So, this is huge stuff. And I have to say that I find the kind of discourse from the Conservative leaders very, very kind of weak on this. And I think that one of the reasons why there's going to be a recession is, of course, the need to contain inflation by raising interest rates. That's one. The squeeze on real incomes caused by the sharp rise in energy prices. And that's facing everybody. And I think there's going to be a global kind of setback. That's obvious. And it's going to be more acute in the UK. One of the reasons it's going to be more acute in the UK is because, our exports to our main market, Europe, are down so much and unlikely to recover very much because we're not in the single market of the customs union. And so, you start with a ball and chain around your feet, even, trying to kind of resuscitate this economy of ours. I think it needs a kind of major mobilization around leveling up, a major mobilization around net zero. It means a major investment in science, and coming out of the EU's Horizon program as the price for not abiding by a treaty in Northern Ireland that we signed, which is the EU's kind of way of saying, if you're not going to abide by the treaty, you can't do the Horizon program. All these things, you start so many kind of yards behind where you need to start, meters behind where you need to start. And then, the things that the government are saying they're going to do are going to make matters worse, not better. I mean, I really fear for a continuing slide in sterling. I really fear for a rise in interest rates to 4% or higher with this inflation rate, and to try and arrest the fall in sterling. I think the knock-on effect on residential house prices in Britain could be very acute. There's talk about it, house prices could fall by 30% in the next 2 or 3 years. All these things are going to make British consumers less confident, less willing to spend, and intensify the recessionary forces. So
let's talk about a policy framework, one that you think is missing. Amelia, if you were to have the ear of the next Prime Minister, would you say you've got to focus on taxes, you've got to focus on productivity, you've got to focus on growth, and which policies might be the best way to stoke that growth?
I think if had the ear of the Prime Minister, what I'd be looking to talk about is reworking Britain's role in the European mainframe, and of course that starts with NATO. But the European Union has a variety of opportunities there that I wouldn't want Britain, simply because it's a Brexit issue, to instinctively ignore. Yeah. So permanent enhanced security cooperation, or PESCO affectionately, is a great opportunity where various ops-based or crisis-based groups are put together from a voluntaristic perspective in the European Union, where you do not need to be a member state. And I think on the basis of the prolific leadership that Britain has already shown in this area, this to me is an excellent opportunity to rework. It's not rejoining, it's sort of realigning. And there's a very sympathetic method by which Britain can set itself up in a helpful, very, very effective, quite a material way. Interestingly, I think what French President Macron came up with not so long ago, the idea of a political community. the idea of a sort of a widening neighborhood in which Britain can still, feel comfortable, still play a part. This vision, I think, is typically ambiguous. I think the more ambiguous it is, in a sense, the more attractive it is, because you don't have the details. But I think it might be an area where Britain can look to find friends, to find re-engagement, to find strategic partnerships that make sense post Brexit. I think also the idea of thinking about Europe as a new neighborhood, if you like. Certainly, I think that we've seen good commitment and support in terms of promoting a huge amount of support with regards to Ukraine. But I mean, thinking about how to rebuild Ukraine and post-conflict solutions and rebuilding requirements are going to be absolutely really, really high on the European foreign policy list. Where is Britain going to be? I think in terms of those decisions, that itself requires Britain to be, really quite mobile and intelligent about where it wants to be. So I would certainly advocate a collective and very creative approach to re-Europeanizing core elements, I think, of Britain's security and defence architecture.
Will, Britain's going to need to make new friends, and international deal-making, it might, of course, include a peace deal with Ukraine. Now, Boris Johnson has been singled out by President Zelensky as, for special praise. I mean, they've even named a road after him in Odessa. There have been generous spending commitments to help. Do you expect more of the same from the next Prime Minister?
Undoubtedly, and I think this is cross-party, and although Johnson was kind of the most prominent of the government, the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss and the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace were scarce less enthusiastic, and I think both of them will be in the next cabinet. And indeed, I think the Labour Party, Keir Starmer and David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, and John Healey, the Shadow Defence Secretary, have also kind of been very strong on this question. I don't think that, Britain's commitment to NATO is very, very substantial. It's second only to the United States. And I think that we will continue to give as much support as we possibly can to the Ukrainian military. So I think that is a kind of sine qua non. International observers should not question that.
We've been talking about trends that have been entrenched for quite a while. And one of those, of course, is climate change. So, Amelia, let's talk about that. Boris Johnson was a big flag bearer for the green agenda. He has ambitious plans to reach net zero by 2050. Is that a policy you expect to continue?
Yes, I think not unlike Ukraine. I think it's enthusiastically bipartisan. I think the government did, quite a credible job with COP26 in Glasgow last year, and used it as an opportunity, I think, to consolidate its role and quite possibly its leadership in this most pressing of areas. It is, I think, something, therefore, that the new Prime Minister and then the next couple of years, what remains of the Tory government and then what happens beyond the general election beyond that, we will see climate change, not just increasingly sewn into the strategy of governments, but I would imagine, and I do hope, along with key issues like Europe, really front and center. I think it has to be, the lodestone, if you like, of how Britain sees itself, not just managing in terms of the very real domestic impacts it's going to have, and we're talking about this in a week that's going to see record-breaking temperatures, but also the way in which it engages with the increasingly alarmed community, if you like, increasingly committed climate change community. But we absolutely have to work in tandem with international partners. So the UK cannot think that just by leaving the European Union, it can set out on the high seas of climate change and achieve all that it wants to do. It absolutely has to be done in tandem. And it has to be done in tandem with the United Nations itself. That is the forum internationally that's going to make and hopefully achieve and also sanction, breakers to those various commitments.
Well, we've talked about so much, from trade to taxes, although I don't think we'll get much policy detail before the autumn, when we will have a new leader of the Conservative Party and new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and when I hope both of you will come back and we can see if any of your predictions have come true. But for now, thank you very much, both of you, Will Hutton and Professor Amelia Hadfield.
Cheers. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out @The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda, the menace of microplastics. What can the world do to clean up the 5 trillion pieces of debris discarded in our oceans? But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.